everybody, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. And tonight I have what I feel is really going to be very helpful for everybody. Tonight we're talking about inquiry-based teaching strategies and how to use those in your classroom. So we're looking at how to go beyond just the ThinkPairShare and try some other strategies that also might be just as effective as that one. So you need to have more than just one arsenal, one tool in your toolbox. So tonight we're going to look at 10 plus different strategies that you can use beyond the ThinkPairShare. So thanks again for joining me. My name is Patty. I am a junior split grade teacher and teacher blogger behind Madly Learning, and I am here every week hoping to help teachers fit it all together to make teaching with inquiry fun and accessible and functional for both themselves and their students. So again, tonight we are talking about inquiry-based teaching strategies that can be used in your classroom. So let's dig in and let's get started right away. Okay, so I have another slide deck for you because I find that with stuff like this, it's often easy that you can follow along and see what I'm talking about when I'm doing this. Now, if you are catching this live on the podcast replay, you can grab this. I will put the link in the podcast description. So I know there's a bunch of you that are catching this live on the replay and just the audio version, so you can't see what I'm showing you. So please find the link for this slide deck in the show notes. All right, so let's get started. So inquiry-based teaching, of course, we're going to start with the ThinkPairShare here. I'm going to move my face here so that you can see it. I'll move myself to the bottom there. The ThinkPairShare is one that most of us are familiar with. It's a three-stage questioning activity where you pose a question to your class and the students group together with elbow partners and they share what they're learning and then they turn and share to the whole group. Now, why do we use this one? Well, because it's great at increasing communication with our students. It's also really good to break up the monotony of who's talking when. So I like to use this, especially in math, if we're doing a direct instruction type activity. I will often break up that monotony of maybe me talking for too much with a ThinkPairShare for my students to get them activated so that they don't kind of fall and drift off into places that I don't want them to. So it also makes more students accountable and gives more students the opportunity to share what they're thinking. They might not be able to share it with you, but I often find that using a ThinkPairShare strategy or other similar strategies that we're going to talk about helps with students blurting out because it gets them heard by other people. So the more frequently I give them opportunities to talk, the less frequently I do have shouting out from the general population in my classroom. So that's a pretty familiar one that most people, but I did promise we were going to be talking about things that were beyond the ThinkPairShare. So let's look at the next one here. So the next one is very similar. It's called ThinkPuzzleExplore. And why I really love this one is because it helps students to identify their background knowledge, and it is great for them to use during a knowledge building circle or a Wonderwall activity because it really has them looking at those artifacts and then understanding that they need to look at it and what does it make them think about. The puzzle section is what could they question about. And then the next is explore. They brainstorm with the group where it is that they could find the resources to answer those questions. So it really kind of frames for students what those steps are for that inquiry process, that first we think about it, then we come up with some questions, and then we look at where we're going to be able to find our answers. And it really helps to scaffold that process for students. And that's Think, Puzzle, and Explore. The other one I've talked about is what I like to call the W5 strategy. And another one is sometimes called the explanation game. Now, I call it the W5 strategy because I like to remind my students sometimes in order to get them to dig as deep as I want them to, in order to look a little bit beyond the surface, sometimes we ask why a couple of times. And I try to say it's why times 5 or the W5 strategy because I want my students to know that if they're going to say something to me, they should get really familiar with listening to me say to them, but why? And often, because I do this so often, some of my students will often start questioning each other and say, she's going to ask you why. So using that strategy can also help. I'm going to get rid of my face here so that you can see the slides. There we go. So with the W5 strategy, it is definitely a framework that helps to build the structures in conversations, and it helps students to dig deeper. So the steps that you do with the W5 strategy include ask and answer. So the first step, you ask a question and then you model this for them. So what do you notice? Well, I notice in this artifact that there is people, it looks like it's from history, if it could be a history perspective. So if you're looking at that, you're modeling for them what you notice about the picture. Then you're going to ask them, why is it this way? Why might it have happened this way? What makes you think that? So they might give you an answer, and then you ask a question. So the extend through questioning and answer section for the W5 strategy kind of goes back and forth, where you're doing this kind of 3 to 5 times, where you're asking them to provide further explanations and further answers and asking them to dig a little bit deeper. Another strategy, which is a bit more complex, but certainly helps you to understand what to do after the Wonderwall activity. So you have a Wonderwall activity and you have these students come up with all of these amazing questions, and then what do you do? Question sort matrix is a strategy that you can use after you've completed a Wonderwall. So after you have maybe a board full of sticky notes and you're not quite sure where to go from there, the question sort matrix is a good one. So students with this activity, help to realize that not all questions are of the same quality. So as teachers, we totally understand this. We know that our students ask some surface questions, some unrelated questions, then sometimes we'll get to those deep questions. So really getting them to sort through the questions that they ask allows them to understand what kind of questions are really great for inquiry. And the first time you may do this, it might be a little bit difficult, and you might get a lot of questions that are pretty surface level and maybe not of great quality. After you've done this a couple of times, your students will start to see that they need to ask higher order thinking questions. They need to ask questions that are going to lead themselves to more inquiry. And I like the question sort matrix because it helps visually students to see this. So what you do is you make a chart. So you have an x-axis and a y-axis. And the x-axis is where you're essentially evaluating the question onto whether or not it is a knowledge and understanding type question. It might be a thinking question, or it might be an application evaluation question. And using hot charts and the cue chart and the question strategy, these are really great ways to kind of see where the questions are. And then you have the y-axis. So once you've plotted all of your questions along that horizontal x-axis, you then have the y-axis where you're evaluating whether or not their interest and answerability to those last questions. So those y-axis, you're looking at the questions, and now you're either moving them up really high because it's a great question that they're really interested in, or maybe you're going to rate it at a 1 because maybe there's not really a heck of a lot of interest in that question. So what you end up creating is you create a scatter plot of questions on your board, where you have all of the questions that are kind of rising to the top are the questions that are giving you information of what your students are interested in. And this really increases student voice and choice in your classroom because they are involved in where these questions go. So this is a great activity to do directly following the questions, the Wonderwall activity, which is the question sort matrix. Another one is that's similar to a ThinkPairShare is a connect, extend, and challenge. Now this one might be happening a little bit further along in your inquiry journey. So it might be happening not necessarily in your engage section, but would be great to happen during your knowledge building circles when you're explaining and exploring. So as learning happens, students need to be able to connect the ideas of the new information they're learning to the previous knowledge that they already have learned. So this is where you would be adding information to, say, your Wonderwall, or you're trying to get them to consolidate some new information and kind of fit it in with what they've previously learned. So what they do is first they share what they have learned. So they do an activity or an experiment, or they read an article, and then they simply just verbatim tell you what they've learned. That's step one. Step two is when they have to connect what they've learned with what they already know. And what they already know is now documented in your classroom on your Wonderwall because you have built that in where you've put those ideas there for you. So the next step is where you're extending their ideas by identifying how the new information that they have has maybe changed their thinking. So if you're looking at tracking this learning on a Wonderwall, they might have a question that they put up or a statement or a hypothesis that they've put up on the Wonderwall, but then they learn something. That might change that hypothesis. It might either confirm or deny something that they had guessed. It might have developed into something new, and they may need to alter what is currently on their Wonderwall posted. So this is a great opportunity when if you've got in a Wonderwall where you've got a lot of misconceptions, and this often happens either in science where they're not really sure how to explain scientific phenomenon, or they're not able to really understand historical context. This is a great way to challenge, to post up the wrong information and then provide them opportunities to challenge their thinking and learn new information. Now, the caveat there is if they are posting wrong information, you absolutely need to be able to create an opportunity for them where they're going to be able to challenge that learning, because you definitely don't want them to go too far ahead with that information and then start thinking that that is really how it goes. That's why I also like making sure that we don't label the things on our Wonderwalls as facts. We always label them as hypothesis until we can prove them, and we prove them by finding something written in multiple sources. The next is 2 stars and a wish. So this might be familiar to you. I added this one because I really like kind of how this frames how I give feedback to my students. And this was a carryover for something that the teachers that teach grade 1, 2, and 3 before the students get to me, they use this, so I've continued to use this. And 2 stars and a wish is a great way to frame the feedback that you're giving your students, because it really focuses on the positive and it doesn't focus on, and has one next step or one place that they can move forward to. So to use 2 stars and a wish, you first have to set the expectations of what you want students to be able to do and make that very explicit for them so that they know what they're going to be evaluated on. They know what their goals are, what they're supposed to be achieving. Once you have that done, they just go ahead and complete their work based and try to meet those expectations. Then you have them self-evaluate. So before you provide them with feedback, you want them to self-evaluate and rate themselves based on how they feel they have achieved those learning goals and expectations. Then either through a conference or just simply assessment of work, the teacher can provide either written or oral feedback to the students and provide it in the framework, almost like that compliment sandwich. It does say 2 stars and a wish. I prefer to have to kind of frame that as 1 star, 1 wish, and then another star. And put that in a compliment sandwich there so that students have a positive that they did really well, a next step of something they can work on, and then also something else positive that I noticed about their work. Now, this one we've talked in a previous episode. This is a communication strategy called IDEAS, and this gives students an acronym that will help them understand how they can add their ideas to a conversation. So if you look at what each one of those letters stands for, it gives you an idea of how students can respond to conversations. So this is great for a knowledge building circle because you want students to learn how to respond in a conversation, and this often does need to be explicitly taught because it's not just simply having a conversation like they are going to outside with their friends at recess. This is an academic type conversation, so they need to have different ways to build on the ideas of others. So I stands for inquire, which students are asking questions of the speaker to build on the discussion. So you have a student present what they know, and then you have other students respond to that sharing by asking the speaker a question. They can also disagree, and sometimes it's great if you explicitly teach them how to disagree respectfully and understand that it's okay if somebody disagrees with you, but the idea is that they should be doing that with respect. You want students to be able to expand and extend ideas by asking why. So this is where your students are going to start using that W5 strategy that we talked about earlier. They will start asking why of the speaker who's sharing. The students can also simply just agree and add on. So they don't always have to be asking a question. They can just say, I agree with you, and here's more things that I know about this. So offering their additional evidence and additional evidence, or offering their support and understanding that, yes, I agree with you. I really liked it when you said this. Adding on and adding more evidence and support to the person who spoke their argument will also add to that conversation. And finally, S in the IDEAS acronym is to summarize and clarify, because sometimes when a speaker says it one way, it resonates with one or two people, but when multiple people take what the speaker said and put it in their own words and clarify and summarize what was said using a different way to say the same thing, often that will allow other students who may not have gotten it the first time, they might get it the second time when it's summarized. So using ideas will help your students add their own ideas to a conversation that is happening during a knowledge building circle. So another one that I really liked, which is similar to Sage and Scribe, except the bonus for this one is that you actually have some data that you can collect from students because they're writing down their ideas. So this one, you still have two partners working together, except instead of think, pair, and share, they are thinking, and then they pair up, and one of them becomes the sage, the talker, and the other one is the scribe, the writer. So the one person will talk, and the other person silently writes what that other person says. So a teacher will ask a question, and then the sage begins telling the scribe their answer. Then the scribe records what was said, and the teacher will then ask a different question, and the students can switch roles. So this one's great because you get that data. So if they're writing stuff down, you can collect that and kind of see what it was that they're talking about. It also does hold them accountable, because sometimes, as you all know, in a ThinkPairShare, sometimes there's kids that are not sharing. So if you've got to record down what your partner said, you do have some information about who is sharing, who's got some great ideas, and maybe who needs to be pulled into a small guided group, and you can have a reteaching of those certain students maybe struggling with their ideas. This is one I like to use sometimes as an alternative during a wonder wall activity. So instead of covering my board with sticky notes, sometimes I like to use a graffiti write. So what I do is I scatter chart papers around my classroom with either an artifact on the chart paper, a word, a quote, a question, a picture, and I let students circulate around the room, stopping at the different chart papers and adding their ideas. Now, the reason it's called a graffiti write is because you try to squish as many kids writing on a paper as possible. Wherever there's room is where they can write. So they don't have to write on the lines. They don't have to write in a list. They're not standing around waiting for a space. They go to a chart paper and they write. So they can be writing in any different direction. Now, in all honesty, most kids, especially your very organized ones, will prefer to write on the lines, but you do get those ones every once in a while that like to they love this activity because they can just write wherever. And you want to have as many colors of markers going as possible, because then it just looks really neat afterwards. Once you're done with the graffiti wall, you can take what they've written and you can kind of circle and group different things that students are writing into different ideas. A jigsaw. Now, this is a popular one. They talk a lot about. I remember this was a big one in Teachers College, but it is a difficult one sometimes to implement, but it is great for inquiry, because often there's so much information that our students need to know, but they don't need to find everything. It takes a really long time if we have every student in our classroom finding information on every single topic when they don't really need to. So I know when I teach habitats, the curriculum doesn't state that students need to understand the details of every single habitat. Same with ancient civilizations. The students don't need to understand every single ancient civilizations in really fine detail, but they do need to know one or two. So a jigsaw is a great way to approach that type of learning, because they have a home group and then they have an expert group. So when you group students into you pick how many topics you're going to cover. So if you're doing ancient civilizations, you pick the different civilizations that your students showed interest in. Maybe there's 3 or 4, and then you group students into groups of 3 or 4. From there, that's their now home group. From there, students then choose an expert topic to explore more in depth. They now group themselves into just expert groups. So everybody who's learning about Rome or everybody who's learning about Egypt groups together. Now those expert groups aren't necessarily working as one whole group, but they are definitely collaborating with each other to share information and support each other to make sure that everyone gets a good quality information. Once the expert groups are done and they've done their research, those experts then return to their home group and share their knowledge to their home group. Now, some of the downfalls that I have found with a Jigsaw is it does require every student to be accountable for doing something. And of course, we always have students in our classroom that don't necessarily or can't necessarily be that accountable. They may need a lot more support from us. So what I normally do is I try to pick those students as an expert group. And while maybe 3 of the other expert groups are working, I will pull that 4th expert group that are full of perhaps some special friends that need more support. And they become a guided group where I will scaffold a lot more for them to make sure that the data gets there, and they might get a bit more support from me, whereas other students are going to be separate. So that's how I try to make a Jigsaw, and I found that that's a bit more successful at making sure that those students are more accountable. And sometimes they actually have my group of special friends that stay with me to do a guided Jigsaw in their expert group. Those students sometimes have a lot to say because they've had a bit more support. So that makes them feel really confident. So that's how I found a Jigsaw to work a little bit more effectively, and then just kind of letting them all go. Learning journals. Now this is one that I fell in love with after using Jennifer Runn's interactive math notebooks. And it really can be done in science and social studies and even language, and of course math, very effectively. If you don't own that interactive math journals notebook resource from her, I highly suggest that you get it. It is amazing, and it's on TPT. So taking kind of that idea and applying that and why it's so great for inquiry is important. So one of the parts of the cycle of assessment and having students learn is that reflective piece, that they have to reflect on learning, that metacognition that they need to develop. So a learning journal is a great tool to use to make sure that students are reflecting on what it is they've learned and evaluating how their learning has grown. So with a reflective learning journal, students start off by identifying in their journal before they learn a specific content area. So if you're looking at their learning goals, they're going to work through those learning goals that you developed at the beginning of the unit, and they're going to write out what that learning goal was. On the top of a piece of paper, they're just going to write out what the learning goal was. Now, if that's painful for some of your students, sometimes it's helpful to just print it and have them glue it into the top. Sometimes copying down a learning goal is sometimes a painful one. Then they talk about what they knew before they've ever learned anything. So before you start exploring perhaps the explain and explore section where they're just beginning to research on a specific topic covering one of their learning goals, they're going to write all of the things they know. Now, a lot of this was probably discussed during your wonder wall and your questioning and their hypothesis, so they're going to write down what they know. After they've gone through a couple of lessons, they've done some research, they've read a few articles, they've had conversations with you, they've done some knowledge building circles, and you feel as though they're ready to kind of move forward and cover the next learning goal, that's a great time for them to be reflective. So after they've done that learning, they can then reflect on what it is they have learned. And they simply just list the new facts and knowledge that they might have, but then they need to prove it. Because any student can probably just write facts and not really understand it, but then they need to prove it. And they can prove that they understand it by drawing a picture and explaining what's happening in the picture. That's great for science. I wanted to make sure that you saw the sources of where this came from. So some of these ideas that we talked to were from Madly Learning, and other ones are from some great websites that I found. Sources include Visible Thinking. Alberta Education has an instructional strategies resource that is great, New Pedagogies for Deep Learning. We Are Teachers, the math learning journals are definitely inspired by Runday's Room, as well as the IDEAS acronym for communication is from our talk a couple of months ago about from Madly Learning. So I just wanted to say thank you everybody for joining me for tonight. And if you would like any of the links or the slide deck from tonight's show, you can grab those at www.madlylearning.com. And that is it for tonight. So join us next week for another episode where we continue to talk about inquiry. And I can't wait to see you again. Talk to you later. Bye.